In this Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire build guide, we're going to take a look at a newly added rogue subclass called Debonaire. I'll be providing information on attributes, weapons, armor, and most importantly, what abilities to take and how to use them. This build was created on the 4.0 version of the game on the Path of the Damned difficulty, with scaling only upwards turned on. The Debonaire rogue class specializes in charming enemies, and it receives the Roguish Charm ability, which does just that and only costs 1 guile. Debonaire rogues also receive 100% hit to crit conversion when attacking charmed enemies, and 15% hit to graze conversion when being attacked if not afflicted at that time. Note that hit to crit works against charmed enemies, not dominated ones. The downside of playing a Debonaire rogue is that they cannot engage enemies, making persistent distraction, which is one of the best passive abilities in the game, unavailable. This subclass also receives the cowardice debuff, which adds a -10 penalty to accuracy if not near another party member. Debonaire rogues can be played as single class, but it isn't necessarily effective. Instead, I've decided to multi-class it with the Beguiler Cypher due to many abilities that can charm enemies. The Beguiler subclass also grants Deception Cypher spells increased range, and restores focus whenever deception spells have been successfully cast on an enemy that is vulnerable to sneak attack. Attribute spread needs to be that of a typical rogue, meaning lots of points into dexterity, perception, and might with additional focus on intellect in order to extend the duration of spells. We are fighting from long range, so resolve is not needed, meaning you can reduce it and put points elsewhere. Races that work best for this build are the ones that provide bonuses to the aforementioned attributes in any way. The following is a list of races that work best. This build is not equipment dependent, meaning you can choose from what you have available and you'll still be okay. Things to focus on are any items that increase perception, dexterity, intelligence, might, or damage in any way. Your primary weapon setup should be dual pistols with proficiency in pistols. Rapid reload is a useful ability since we need to take a lot of actions and do not want to waste too much time reloading our guns. The great thing about pistols is that they are ranged weapons, which increases your survivability and gives the option to cast spells from far away. This allows you to charm enemies left and right, picking them off one by one without being in too much danger. Armor should be lighter in order to have reduced recovery time. High Harbinger's robe, Miscreant leather, and Swift Hunter's garb, and anything similar is the type of armor we're looking for. For other items, I would recommend Thaus's headdress, Adjumant stocking cloak, Sash of Judgment, or anything similar. There are many options as mentioned above. This is not an equipment-dependent build. There aren't many abilities we need to make this build work, and what this build focuses on is using Cypher Deception spells to debuff enemies and control them afterwards. Whisper of Treason is a level 1 ability and charms enemies. This gives you already 2 charming abilities at level 1, which can be very beneficial. Phantom Foes is the second ability that is a must-have. It inflicts flanked in a huge radius for about 30 seconds, giving you a bonus to accuracy and is a much easier way of inflicting an additional 50% damage via the Death Blows passive. The next must-have ability is Ringleader. It dominates one target and charms enemies around it, making it a perfect fit for this build. Next to these 3 must-have abilities, I would highly recommend anything that inflicts intellect afflictions because it reduces will defense, making dominating and charming enemies easier. Mind Plague is a good example. From Rogue, we only need Debilitating Strike to do a high amount of damage, and Smoke Cloud or Shadowing Beyond to get out of danger. The following is a list of must-have abilities. These are not all the points you can spend, so you do have wiggle room to add anything you like to the build. Debonaire. Debilitating Strike, an amazing ability that increases damage dealt by 25% and adds 2 bonus penetration. Next to that, it is a full attack, meaning you're going to attack with both weapons at once. This is the ability you'll be using the most as it only costs 1 AP and is available very early in the game. The debilitating upgrade also puts the Distracted Affliction on the enemy. Shadowing Beyond, a useful ability for this build that can be exchanged for Smoke Veil. Both are fine, but Shadowing Beyond lasts longer, giving you more time to cast self-buffing abilities without breaking stealth. Next to that, it grants you plus 50 deflection for 10 seconds, increasing survivability by a lot after exiting stealth. Smoke Veil makes you invisible for a small period of time. Good for escaping bad situations, but is not as reliable as Shadowing Beyond because invisibility is easily broken in many ways. The benefit is it costs only 2 guile, unlike Shadowing Beyond, which costs 3. Backstab increases damage from stealth if 2 meters or closer to the opponent. It can lead to massive damage when used with Crippling Strike. 2-weapon style increases recovery time when wielding 2 weapons, a must for this build since dual weapons are used. Dirty Fighting converts 10% of hits to crits, works with melee attacks and abilities, making it a must for any damage dealing class. Deep Wounds, 20% of damage dealt added as raw damage over time. A great ability for increasing your overall damage output. Uncanny Luck, a useful passive that adds 5% chance to avoid any attack and adds 5% hit to crit conversion that stacks with 10% hit to crit conversion from dirty fighting. Slippery Mind, a great survival ability that makes you immune to perception, intellect, and resolve afflictions while bloodied or near death. Improved Critical, increases crit damage by 10%, making it a must for any damage dealing class. Death Blows, increases damage done by 50% with abilities and weapons against any opponent that suffers from 2 or more afflictions that enable sneak attack. We don't have Persistent Distraction this time to get easy access to Death Blows, but it is easily obtainable after casting Phantom Foes and Debilitating Strike, or any other ability that puts an affliction on the enemy. Beguiler, Whisper of Treason, charms one enemy. This one goes without saying since the entire theme of the build is to charm enemies for guaranteed criticals. Phantom Foes, a must-have ability that puts the flank status on anyone in a huge area. Ringleader, dominates one enemy and charms other enemies around the dominated one. It has a small AoE, but when many enemies are stacked on the party tank, it makes it a quite valuable thing to have. Mind Plague, puts Confused and Dazed on an enemy, reducing stats. Confused reduces Intelligence by -5, which reduces Will Defense, and Dazed reduces Might by -5, Penetration by -4, and the enemy cannot engage. Just an example of an ability that reduces Will Defense. You can add on top of this or replace the ability with something else that reduces Will Defense. Draining and Biting Whip. Any of these 2 upgrades is fine. Draining Whip restores focus more quickly, while Biting Whip does more damage. Combat Focus. Start combat with concentration. We are casting spells, so it's important not to get interrupted immediately. Lingering Echoes. Increase duration of afflictions caused by a cipher by 10%. Since we want enemies to be vulnerable as long as possible, this is a no-brainer. Hammering Thoughts. Adds +1 penetration with weapons. More penetration equals more damage. More damage equals more dead enemies. The Empty Soul. Adds +10 accuracy to cipher spells targeting enemy will. This is every spell we are using, making this a must. Does not work with Roguish Charm. Rapid Casting adds +10% action speed with spells, making casting a bit faster. Since we're casting often, this makes perfect sense. As with any rogue, I would recommend starting the fight from stealth. If you are using melee weapons instead of ranged ones, go for Crippling Strike from stealth for massive damage. If you're using ranged weapons, then use stealth to stay safe at range and start combat with Crippling Strike, or wait it out until everyone is in position before you act. Remember to have one other ranged party member somewhere near you so that you do not get the cowardice debuff. After the fight starts, your rotation should look something like this. Use Phantom Foes to put the flank status on enemies. Flanked reduces their deflection defense. Then cast Mind Plague or any other will-reducing spell to have more of a chance of charming and dominating them. Then use Roguish Charm or Ringleader to charm and dominate enemies. Then use Debilitating Strike to start destroying enemies. Do not target dominated enemies, only charmed ones, because you only receive hit to crit conversion against these. Pay attention to timers to let enemies fight each other a bit, and then start picking off charmed ones when the effect is close to expiring. Charmed is going to be removed from enemies that are hit, but the damage you do is going to be massive, so finishing them off is easy. This build can be played from early on in the game because you get Whisper of Treason, Roguish Charm, and Crippling Strike at level 1. Add other abilities and passives from the list, and add some of your own on top of that. The build shines against anything that can be dominated or charmed, and it's still good against enemies that are immune to it. You only need to use Phantom Foes and any other ability that puts an affliction. That way, Death Blows is activated, and you get plus 50% bonus damage. As for skills, I would recommend Stealth or Alchemy. With Stealth, it's going to be much easier staying invisible when the fight starts, so that you can act whenever you want. Alchemy increases the potency and duration of drugs, which are useful despite the nerfing to them. Use any drug that boosts perception would be most beneficial. Stay tuned for more Pillars of Eternity 2 build guides as we cover a few more that are possible due to the new DLC.